Last time we dealt with Shlomo, who you might know as Solomon, but today we'll find out more about Suleiman, who's the same reet bloke that served us well until he didn't. Learn about how wise Suleiman was to insects. Yes, insects. And how the man really fancied horses.
A bit dodgy, if you ask me, and you did ask, for this is Almighty Answers.
Hello, us favourites, us lovelies. It is I, the Almighty. In us last video, we talked about
King Solomon, whose name in Hebrew is Shlomo.
Do you recall? He were a well-reached bloke. Until he weren't, but I still gave him superpowers because of us benevolence. I'm such a lovely God. In this video, we'll be talking about Suleiman, who is both Shlomo and Solomon, but the Islamic version. Why not focus on Solomon, the one that Christians acknowledge? Well, that bloke weren't that different from his Hebrew counterpart, and I reckon I've already done a champion job in last video. I always do a champion job in every video. Might come back to him, might not. It's us choice, isn't it? If you were the Almighty, then you might decide. But I am. So na 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 na. Right, Suleiman has the same origin as Shlomo and Solomon, son of King David or Dawood, and also a prophet and messenger. He rules over Israel at its height after inheriting it from his da, an empire that reached from modern Palestine through what you humans now consider Yemen, although that may have changed by the time you're watching this. Who knows? I know. I always know. Suleiman was a well-reached chap, as I said, and in the Islamic version, he had the same superpowers as Shlomo, but could even talk to animals and jinn. Yeah, that's right. Pff, what do you need? Pff, what do you need? Oh, but to be free. A genie like the one from that very litigious company, whose name I shan't give, because even though I'm omnipotent, I'm still not that powerful. Of course, I'm still more powerful. He's a mouse, not a dirty. Suleiman actually could speak to jinn, which are essentially spirits that could be in the form of the all too familiar genies you simple-minded humans know. They could be both bad and good, selfish and altruistic, you know, just like you lot, except not you lot. I mean, I didn't imbue them with free will like I did you, so they're not as special.
You're very special. We love you. Go home in peace.
In the Islamic version, I did give Suleiman the gift of the gab, particularly the gift to gab with animals. True story. One such story is that he talked to... Can you guess? What? Wrong. Polar bears? Honestly, do you know any polar bears in the Middle East? I swear you lot are right numpties sometimes. No, he talked to some ants, although he famously talked to and sang with birds. Oh, not birds like young ladies, although he spoke to them too, I suppose, considering he married about 40,000 of them, the mad bastard. The birds with feathers and wings, and he could also understand the language of all animals, like ants. I wonder if he ever talked to birds about the ants, or vice versa, and how awkward that conversation would be. Wow. Them ants is like well-eggy, innit? Do you get what I mean? Whatever. They make a right good snack to this ping, and they're real easy to get to like, man, them. Meanwhile, the ants sounded like, "These ruddy birds, they keep ruining our bloody formations by bloody eating us. No. We shan't tolerate any more of that. We did not drill and drill and drill for all that. We must defend the colony at all costs, lads. Man up." I don't need to wonder, because I were there. Yeah? Anyway, I granted old Suleiman the gift to command not just birds, but animals, the wind, jinn, and even bloody clouds. He were a well-champion bloke, this Suleiman, until he strayed from me for a bit, but we'll get to that shortly. Now, one day, Suleiman were faffing about, leading his army somewhere to take over some place, as one did in those times. Mind you, his army wasn't just any old army, but one with humans, jinn, and birds. Well, gladly this army, eh? This army were marching, as armies do, and this reet wee ant saw them, and mind, this ant were beautiful. If that meant she, and yes, it's a she in this story, this ant could have had really thick eyelashes or a gingham dress. Well, that's up to you to decide. Anyway, although what you imagine is not what happened anyway, you miserable sods. The ant were a real Bernadette Olsen. Yeah. She were well worried about Suleiman's marching army of humans, genies and birds, so she told her colony to get themselves into their dwellings, and they did just that. Now, I quite fancied this ant, not because of her beauty, but I reckon she were well fit for an ant, although that's not really abnormal. But I digress. This ant, I fancied her, and I weren't taking the piss, so I sonic boomed her message to Suleiman, because her voice were right faint, and he were leading his army, which was well loud. Yeah. Oh, he were also on a cloud, because, well, why the not? Suleiman heard the ant's cry for her people's insects, to get back into their homes until the army had passed, because they were so small that they'd be trampled. The well-wise king heard this, laughed, and agreed not to trample all over this ant colony that were far as away, even though the ant understood that if Suleiman's army or some other bloke's army knocked about and crushed a colony, then Bob's your uncle, innit? Yeah. It didn't really matter ultimately, just like everything else in existence. So this is some kind of moral about the power one voice can have. A tiny ant can sway an army. I mean, I had a lot to do with it, but it's a good lesson, isn't it? It shows the wisdom of Solomon to listen to the counsel of literally the smallest of creatures. Although it probably took the piss out of his army to avoid some tiny ant colony, to be honest. Anyway, that weren't the only time Suleiman involved himself with animals, because there's an incident involving horses. You see, Suleiman ruled over a well-prosperous Israel, and he were quite fond of horses, like proper into them. In fact, he received 4,000 of them one day as a gift. Mind you, horses back in those days were not only a symbol of wealth, but of pragmatic use, because they were the only reliable mode of transportation and logistically necessary, really. Yeah. However, Suleiman was the leader of the most champion kingdom that ever existed. Well, so they claim, but what's a wee bit of propaganda, eh? Thus, maybe he shouldn't have been all chuffed about these horses as he were, yeah? He were well chuffed.
Too chuffed, and it weren't good. Yeah.
Suleiman fancied these horses so much, so in love with them was he, that he missed the evening prayer.
The evening prayer. How dare he?
This is, of course, a lesson, us dearies. He noticed he'd missed us evening prayer and immediately repented. He understood that to proceed with me as his right gladly godly almighty, he had to forsake his horses to atone. He may or may not have slaughtered the horses, but that depends on the version to which you subscribe. But I were well chuffed with Suleiman, and so he asked me to grant him a kingdom such as will not belong to anyone after him. He even called me the bestower, like I was some champion superhero. Or supervillain. Huh? Well, he was such a reet bloke, and he appealed to me ego directly, that I had to comply, and he may or may not have slaughtered the horses to appease me. Not only did I grant his request, oh, did I? I gave him what he wanted, and even gave him a way to travel faster than any reet horse. That's right, the cloud I mentioned earlier that he rode whilst leading his army. It were my gift to him for forsaking his horses and calling me bestower. Some accounts differ as to if this were a cloud or a platform, but he could muller flying records riding on this thing, because he could cover a month's journey in a single morning. It would have ripped the flesh off his face and body, but he had us protection. Oh, did he? That's what a little buttering up of the scone that is as holiness gets you. The other famous story pertaining to Suleiman was about the Queen of Sheba, called Bilquis. Sheba is roughly a modern-day Yemen, and Bilquis weren't her actual name, but her title. Now, she were a well-fit bin, wise and proper loaded, but they were a problem. Suleiman were reviewing his army of people, genies and birds. Yes, birds, and one of the birds in his army were the hoopoe. Its name comes from its cry, and it looks well odd thanks to his crown on its head. I weren't the most judicious when it came to design. I mean, have you seen the human body? Yikes. The hoopoe was Suleiman's water scout in that it would search the lands for water when his army marched. One day, his hoopoe went AWOL from his army, and Suleiman weren't too happy until the bird returned and told him,
I was out on a laugh, when I spotted this land called Sheba, and it was beautiful and massive. And mate, let me tell you about this throne she got me. But Lord, there's a real big problem. The people of this land worship the sun and not Allah.
Now you can imagine how that made me feel, even though I know everything. So Suleiman sent Bilquis a letter proclaiming us virtues, because he were a reet bloke, as I've said a million times, until he weren't. Bilquis sent him a response with jewels, but Suleiman never replied, because maybe he had enough wives. I don't know. Bilquis then decided it were proper for her to go pay him a visit, but everyone knew about her reet as fuck throne, so a djinn offered to teleport a ruddy throne to Suleiman's palace instantly, which he accepted. You see, Suleiman were also afraid that Bilquis were a demon because his djinns had told him, so he wanted to ensure that this bird didn't have the ass of an ass, or the hooves of an ass that she would have covered with her dress. Suleiman were proper wise, but also didn't want to offend, so he had a glass floor in place. When Bilquis finally arrived, she saw the glass floor and lifted her dress to show her legs, which were obviously human ones. What the f***, honestly, because she thought the floor were water and didn't want to get her dress wet. This convinced Suleiman that she weren't no demon because her legs were well fit. Maybe like an ant's. Who the knows? They entered the palace and espied her throne, and she immediately recognised this and convinced Bilquis to believe in yours truly, as you should too. Continue believing in us and show your love and adoration for these videos as you share, subscribe and like them. I read all your feedback and know exactly what you're doing whenever you're doing it, so why not keep watching these videos and tell all your little mates about them, eh? Huh? You better. Next time we'll talk about the Song of Solomon. That's all for this week. Ta-da, my lovelies. Ta-da. Tatty bye now. Tatty bye. Subscribe, that is, my children. Now share, like, and
Leave a comment.
I get lonely sometimes and I love me some questions, and hey, remember, soon you'll be able to follow me on other social media channels. You will.